Now, you might know of one or two such technologies. For example, translation has such a problem, right? And so we use pre-translation expansion and post-translation expansion, which are comparable corpus techniques, if you think about it, in cross-language IR. Or perhaps you might have been thinking I was talking about speech, which I showed you the gaps and the effect of the gaps from yesterday. And indeed, Amit Singhal did his dissertation work on problems that actually work immediately after his dissertation, I think, on problems related to this. So expansion of the representation of spoken content in this way. So IR people love comparable corpora, and NLP people yawn when they see comparable corpora. Okay, so that's one thing. The second thing you might do is you might use it for finding parallel text. So that's actually one of the motivations, as I understand it, for doing the cross-language Indian new search task. But you have to think then about what you mean by this problem. So Parth gave an example yesterday of there might be some embedded direct translation, right? I mean, there's a document and we translate something, and we include it in our document because we actually want to translate it there. So that's great. But you might also find cross-language paraphrase. So the people who work on building machine translation systems, they call this pseudo-parallel text. So this wasn't actually a careful word-by-word translation. This was just a sort of a re-expression, but we still might be able to use it. So this is, MT is an extrinsic measure of the ability to find parallel text, right? We see if our T gets better, and if it gets better, we're happy because we know nothing about language. What we care about is statistics, right? Okay, so that's a second possibility. The third one, I've never seen anyone talk about, but it becomes sort of really obvious when you look at the fourth one, that you might find machine translation results that you yourself had produced, right? So imagine you produce a machine translation system and you put it out on the web and people use it to translate their stuff, and then they correct your translations, right? And you discover your own translation corrected. My gosh, that's got to be worth its weight in gold, right? I mean, everybody's sitting here saying, no, there's the mistake, right? I mean, it's like they're doing your failure analysis for you. Got it? Okay, so that might be really interesting. And then the fourth one is the one that Google has to worry about. So Google goes and crawls the web to find parallel text. Yeah, doing exactly what you're talking about. They're doing it. And what they find is Google Translation, and which they then use to train the Google MT system, which is like a really bad idea. So Google had to build a detector for Google translations so that they could reject them. Now think about it. If they could tell they were bad, they wouldn't have done it, right? You can use that to improve your MT. You're going to tell bad news to translate it some other way. So they have this odd position of having to be intentionally a little bit bad, just so that they can tell it's their own stuff, right? I mean, you sort of have to screw your head around to understand how we're going to get much out of that. But we might. Now, on the other hand, if you don't build an MT system, you just go crawl on the Google MT, train on it, you'll have an MT system as good as Google. So that's the alternative, sort of statistically reverse engineering Google. Okay, and then the final example comes from Carol Peters. So in 1996, we all got together to start talking about cross-language retrieval, and Carol Peters, the founder of CLINSS, wasn't actually interested in cross-language retrieval. What she was interested in was building tools for translators. And translators don't want to see translations. Now that's going to strike you as a little bit odd, right? Translators who see a phrase they don't know how to translate do not want to see a translation of the phrase. Because we can use machines to make stilted translations. The reason we hire humans is to make elegant, beautiful, natural translations. And therefore, the humans need to see elegant, beautiful, natural translations. So what you want to do is you want to issue a document and get back a whole bunch of nice examples of how related things are said, which a person can look at. So we don't have to use the machine's processing in as a objective function. We can have as our goal to help human translators by finding natural stuff, and that might be the very best use of comparable worker, right? Because that's actually where there's a user group that is asking for this now. Okay, so that said, I do think you have to give some thought to which of those are you trying to do, because it will tell you which things you want to find, and when you have the classification task, it will tell you which categories do you want to put it in for the ways in which it might be used. Now, as I say, I know nothing about cross-language Indian news story search, but I do know something about related work. So let me tell you something about what I think is related work, and you can decide if it's related. One is this idea of news events. We want to find stories on the same news event. So there was a task called topic detection and tracking, in which people tried to do something like that. I'll tell you a little bit about it. But then there's this idea of the focal event, the part of the news story that we're looking at now. And there have been people that have tried to do something that you might call focal events. The Trek Interactive Track is probably the best known. The Trek Web Track's diversity task. You see, if they won't let you create a track, then you find an existing track to create a task. And if you can't do that, then you create a subtask, and you get the idea, right? So this is a part of the Web Track, and they're doing something also similar. Their advantage is they're doing it now, but their disadvantage is they're doing it on result sets collections. But they're working with similar questions, and they have a nice sort of ontology for thinking about this. So first, TDT. TDT is a cousin of Trek. Now, it's not really a cousin Trek liked very much. Some family relationships were a little strained. This one was. Trek is a very community-owned, open sort of a thing. NIST coordinates it with a benevolent hand. A little Mandar-like. I mean, you might think of it that way. Whereas TDT was, well, y'all come and work on this problem. We've got some money for you, and then we'll talk about what the evaluation will be, and then we'll go off and you'll do it well, right? After we agree. So it's very collegially defined, but it's collegially defined with a small group, right? So it's not exposed as much to critique. It doesn't show up as much in SIG-IR. And when we talk about the 3 evaluations that predate fire, we never mention it, right? Because it's not one of us, it's one of them. So anyway, TDT was going on in the same time frame, and quite a lot of, so it predates NCIR, predates Clay, and quite a lot of interesting things were done there, but by a relatively small group of people, and without its results being as well disseminated as they might be. It follows a fairly standard pattern for these kinds of programs, which is that the Linguistic Data Consortium in the US, this thing is cutting out often. Y'all hear me okay? You hear me okay now? No. Okay, we'll keep it on. The Linguistic Data Consortium in the US does the annotation, and NIST does the evaluation. So it's unlike Trek, in which NIST does both. And the reason for that is because the annotations, as you'll see, are fantastically expensive. The LDC also does the collection. So one of the things that makes TDT interesting to look at is if you wanted to solve whatever problem you're working on, and you imagined that you had 10 times as much money, TDT would be a nice example. So this LDC and NIST split occurs when money is going to be poured into the development of evaluation resources. That's LDC's mission, is the development of language resources, evaluation resources being one of them. There were 5 tasks. One of them was story segmentation because they processed written and spoken news, and the spoken news had to be broken up into stories. You can ignore that. There are ground truth annotations available for the story segmentation. You can even ignore all the spoken news if you want to, but there are transcripts available for it as well. Then there was a topic tracking task. The way the topic tracking task works is I show you the first story on a topic, and you show me all the rest of it, right? And a topic here has a funny meaning. It's not the Trek meaning of topic. In Trek, a topic could be like an airplane crash. You can't have a topic like that here. The only topic you can have is the crash of Plan Am Flight 103, a specific airplane crash. That looks a lot like your definition, doesn't it? It's a news event, right? So what they call a topic, you call a news. The topic tracking techniques, you either had 1 or 2 or 4 training examples, and they were invariably in English, but the documents were in English, Chinese, and Arabic, and you had to get them all. Right? So, quite an interesting problem. You could slice and dice the data quite a lot of ways, speech and text, one source versus another source, one topic versus another topic, Arabic, Chinese, English, same language training, mixed language training, all sorts of things. Okay, or cross-language training. The topic detection track task used exactly the same relevance judgments. And these relevance judgments were nuts. These people went, and for 100 topics, 57,000 documents, they read every document and annotated it for every topic. Because they weren't from track, and they didn't believe in pooling. They believed in pooling the following year, right? Because that was 5.7 million relevance judgments. It's the largest exhaustively assessed collection ever made, to the best of my knowledge. And it was completely unaffordable to repeat that, and you couldn't scale up beyond 57,000 documents. So all kinds of interesting things done, but in topic detection, you are supposed to find every topic. So you just feed in the news stories, and out come the clusters, and the clusters are topics. They're these news events, right? And they spent ages arguing about what the evaluation measures should be, so you may or may not like their evaluation measures, but you can read about them and so on. They're there, and they're well thought out, and their problems have been well critiqued. And there's if you just type TDT, NIST, there's web pages there, papers, TDT, OPC, all the data. They have first story detection task. So this was, I show you a story somewhere in the middle, you tell me what was the first story. That's kind of cute, yeah. But I mean, if you could solve the topic detection task, that was trivial. You just sort them and do the first one. And indeed, there was some nice work on linking between those two that did get done. And then there's also a link detection task, which is, I give you 2 stories, you tell me if they're on the same topic. Yeah, it's a baby version of all the other tasks, right? And so it allowed you to focus, and it had a different set of metrics that were appropriate for just focusing on that. It confused it with averaging over lots of stuff. This is one of the most important things that emerged from TDT, that there are lots of different types of news events, and you can productively put them together into sets of these, and then build relevance judgment guidelines that are unique to each set. So the relevance judgment for saying whether this is on the same election as that are very different from saying whether it's on the same celebrity human interest news as that, right? That these are different kinds of problems. And so having this inventory, which emerged bottom up from the data, was very useful, and of course led to improved inter-annotator agreement, which was its goal. Here's an example for each of these. This one is category 3, legal and criminal cases, from that previous list. And you have a rule of interpretation. And the rule of interpretation tells you for each type of seminal event. So a seminal event is a focal event in your language, but it's always, by definition, the first, right? So it is the seminal event, the thing that caused all the other things. So for each type of seminal event, the rules of interpretation will tell you what other kinds of, what you would call focal events, are directly related. This then informs the annotator's judgment about the scope of the topic. So this is an indirect way of defining the scope of the topic, and further about which topics should be labeled as well. So here's an example for legal and criminal cases. First, we get a specific example, so you can go follow the thread, and I'll show that to you in a moment. And then it tells you the seminal events. So these are the events that might have been the first reported event for such a case, right? So it might not be that the crime was first reported. It might be that the arrest was first reported, right? Or it might be that the verdict was the first thing you saw reported. Right? So there are many criminal cases in the U.S. where the crime and the trial and all of that get no coverage. But then when the verdict comes out, it's such a surprise, such an abomination, that gets covered. Right? So the seminal event can be any of these things. And then the topic, that's what you would call the news event, could be anything that, for example, the coverage of the initial crime, the entire investigation, the trial, and the outcome, but not, notice this is important, the laws that change afterwards. And the reasoning for this was that in TDT generally, the focal events for a news event had to be direct, unavoidable consequences. So the law, changing the law later, was a separate choice someone made, right? Okay. So there's no right or wrong here. We're just looking at examples. So here's an example of the Atomic 3003. This is the example given for legal and criminal cases. This is the Pinochet trial. So Pinochet was an Argentinian dictator, I think, or Chilean dictator. And you can see the seminal event is given and a description of the topic is given. And then there's a rule of interpretation is referred back to. And if you click on 3003, you get, this is a condensation of a 4-page description of every single thing that happened in this news event, which is constructed after the fact by going through all that news. And this allows the assessors to document the decisions that they made, the things that were in, the things that were out, how they did searches, that sort of thing. Right? The judgments here are not done by pooling. The judgments here are done by people following things around. And then there's pooling done after the fact to catch things, which they call highly ranked assessments. We'd be better off if we talked about search guided and highly ranked. And this whole pooling thing was just that we did nothing but highly ranked. Right? Okay. Here's the corpus. So this is the sort of an amazing thing. You get into one of these programs, and you get the LDC people sitting there, and they got $1 million budget just for data. And you're sitting there and you have a wish and you say, oh, can we get some Al Jazeera? And they're like, Al Jazeera. And Al Jazeera shows up, right? So these were all the things that they could come up with, that we could come up with, that we went off. We got those 400,000 documents for which we have both search guided and highly ranked assessments in the last years of the program ran. And then this was the 5th of the collections that were built. So there are 5 of these collections. Right now, the first collection is really a non-collection. The second collection was a development collection. So 3, 4, and 5 are really the interesting ones. And 3 is the one that's completely assessed. It's completely assessed only in English and Czech. Okay. So that's TDT. Questions on TDT? Seem related at all? Yeah. Yeah, so one of the weaknesses of this is that when the Americans spend money on something, it gets kind of an American cast on it. It's kind of like, when Disney makes a movie, it looks a little American. Yeah, so this has got that written all over it. So everything's done in English first, and then you go and find all the stuff in the other languages. Majority at that point have a mental model of what's going on. Okay, so good question. So the next thing I want to talk about, so that was mostly about news events, right? That didn't, local events were just kind of in there, but they weren't annotated. Now, one of my students who wanted to do some work on aspect clustering, which actually you would call focal event, went through and re-annotated them for focal events. Re-annotated some of the track topics. So those are available, our TPP topics. So those are available for you if you want. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is the track interactive track. And the whole idea of the interactive track was that this was here just to piss off the people that made, did you say that here? Anyway, in an effort to upset the people who just did making rank lists and measuring statistical significance. So this was the people who eventually went off, and we were talking about this earlier today, invented IIIX and HCIR and all those things nobody can pronounce. And what they were seeking to do was just to show the track people that there was life beyond making rank lists. And so they wanted to run interactive experiments, and they needed some measure that could prove that people were better than machines. And so they came up with this measure called aspectual recall. And the idea was I have some topic, and it's got some aspects, and we're going to see how many aspects you can find. Right? The funny thing is later the machine people said, oh, what a great idea, and started doing this themselves. Thank you very much for the training data, which they still use. But nonetheless, this comes from the idea of doing things interactive. And sometimes they happen to pick things that you would call news events, and usually they pick things that were, you know, I don't know, tell me about Monica Lewinsky or something, right? So things that didn't have an event focus. But they did instance annotation, and they started with the documents that have been judged to be relevant for existing topics, and they just sorted them in some emergent, bottom-up, human way of doing it. And so here's an example. This is topic 352I, which is just 352. It's got the same title and description as track topic 352, but then the instruction for how to make instances is here. So you're supposed to find as many different incidents of human smuggling, ... Okay, now I copied the wrong thing, so this is not human smuggling, this is the channel tunnel. Sorry about that. Parth asked me if my slides were ready, and I'm like, oh yeah, of course they're ready. And so, you know. So anyway, this is from some other one, which is the channel tunnel. So that one wasn't so event-oriented, but opening of the channel tunnel is kind of an event, right? You can think what will be the consequences of that. And so you can see what kinds of consequences people wrote about, like they thought there'd be more quick visits to France. They thought there'd be fewer Japanese investors in Europe. That's not really clear to me how they came to that conclusion, but anyway, that's one of the things people were talking about. All kinds of things. They thought it would increase the chances of getting EC grants, so this sounds like they're IR researchers, right? And they're thinking, well, maybe we could put money on these trains and send them here, or something like that. Number 10 is the one that struck me as odd. The improved passenger service with Europe. So this is sort of not realizing that UK is actually in Europe, right? These are American relevance assessors, and you can see this cultural bias again, right? Okay, and anyway, it goes on, there are 28 of these. And so you can't really use these because there aren't very many that are event-oriented. This is the closest I could find. But you can look at this as an example, and you can ask whether or not you're trying to do something like this, and you can ask whether or not any two people would come up with the same categories. And in fact, you can look at their data and see if you come up with the same categories. And so there's a place to start at least. Now, the other place to start when you're looking at that is the WebTrax diversity, task. And that was started in 2009. And the idea was, you know, that web search engines, they don't like to show you two sets of documents from the same place, or 3 or 4 or 5 from the same, trimmed URL. They like to give you documents in different places, and going further, they like to give you documents on different aspects of the topic. And so they have to have some way of measuring how well they're doing that. And so the diversity task was supposed to do that. But of course, they only want to do that on search results, right? I mean, if I cluster the web, we're going to be at it for a little while. we might finish, before breakfast anyway. And so that's the specific task. The general goal is to limit redundancy, but then that made them answer the question, what's redundancy? Right? And you realize these people don't know what the person really wants to know. But neither do you. Right? So there are two kinds of redundancy. One is they ask a question, and you don't know what they meant, because the words can mean lots of things. Or the other one is they ask a question, and it's got lots of parts, and you don't know what part they wanted. So here's an example. They call this second one faceted. That's a little like focal events. But none of these things are set up event-oriented, so this is just sort of reasoning by analogy. This is the closest one I could find that was like an event, which is the user comes along and they type toilet. And you're supposed to tell them the answer, right? And it's like, that's got to be one of the tougher queries to answer well. But in any case, the track assessors, they look at this, and you can tell what kind of a mind they have because they hallucinate a user. Right? The user's not there. They don't know. So they just hallucinate a user. They look at the clicks to try to guess. And they hallucinate that this user is actually meant to say, find information on buying, installing, and repairing toilets. Now that's not what you would call a specific event, but it's a kind of event, closest I can come up with. And they get very specific, like, from this toilet, the poor search engine, which, has never met a person before in its life, right? Couldn't hold a conversation to save his life, is supposed to figure out that the human being wants to know, I'm looking for a Kohler wall-hung toilet, where can I buy one? Right? Okay, well, anyway, good luck on that one, but that's what we're trying to make our web search engines do, and that might be of some help in thinking through this idea of what do you mean when you say a focal event, right? So some people think it's the same. Now, I was really inspired by Pablo because he gave a talk in which it was loaded with jokes, and he just never cracked a smile, right? And so I thought I'd at least try to crack a smile when I tell a joke at the end, right? So here's my try. How am I supposed to pronounce this? I've been working on this all day. CLINSS? Not working. CLINSS? It's actually my first try. It was CLINSS. Cleanness. Came up with that one right here at the end. CLINSS. You can just see this game of telephone going on here, right? Okay, so I really think you guys need a better name than CLINSS. Right? You're going to have to think about how to pronounce these acronyms when you go making them. Now, we had some talk about segmentation of morphology earlier, right? Morphology, this stemming business is just a segmentation problem, right? We're just trying to segment the morpheme. So this is based on a particular segmentation, right? At the exclamation point. But you could segment this in other places. You can get kill mice. Yeah? I'm hoping that's not what was meant, but or sea lions. Yeah? Mice, which is how we live. You have the pronunciation.
I just wanted to continue the joke because you should never ask what was the way they reinvented it for the previous year because that inverted I there is a very interesting thing to know. So.
Okay, well, the other one I was going to try was pan and fire, but it really wasn't nearly as good, right? I was going to have a frying pan, it was going to be on the fire. But then I thought, this is cross-language, and I really should have more than one language represented. So then I was off looking for pictures of bread that was on the fire. Sorry.
No, it's one of the topics last year was about the incredible India. So because of the advertisement, we kept the exclamation point. I'm a
Research in the U.S. has shown that you can get twice as much money from the government if you ever pronounce it black.
And then, yes, with respect to the previous talk, certainly you are right, but I wanted to overstress the fact that we have to work with the verbal humor, verbal irony. So there is no model, you don't have any pitch, you don't have any help in the model, the other model passage.
Yes.
Just text, that's what text.
I'll-
There you can, you have to find it funny enough, but you don't have any help.
Good point, good point, okay. Some people have harder